January 22nd edition of Trips and Traps. Travis Stone alongside of Richard Migliore. We're in the middle of January, and I think winter's finally starting to settle in as we wait for what's supposed to be Snowmageddon Part 2, I guess, tomorrow.
Well, I think we've stolen a lot of time, though, so we can't really complain. We've gotten away with a soft pace up to this point.
Yep.
And speaking of pace, well, we've got an eclectic mix of races this week and maybe a couple opportunities for some education.
Let's dive right in. We got 4 races on tap this week, and like you said, it's a very diverse group. A couple of different angles to look at, horses to maybe bet against or consider betting next time out depending on their price. We're going to kick things off on the 14th of January in the 4th race. And Richie, one of the things you always seem to say is when you're talking about going 2 turns on the inner dirt, it is so important to save ground. Here's a look at Wild Night at the Opera. Save ground, this horse does not.
He never has an opportunity. He's drawn wide. It's a bad post. 1 mile, very short run to the turn. Chris DiCarlo came out, looked like he wanted to go forward, get some position, looks over, sees 4 heads stacked up inside of him. Then when he takes a hold of Wild Night at the Opera, the horse kind of leans back into them. I think you've got to make those decisions just a little bit quicker. Either be ultra aggressive or kind of take up a little bit, almost miss the break a step and try to tuck in somewhere. Bad post, tough hand he was dealt. I say this all the time, and I think this is what you're alluding to, Travis. When you're going to be wide on the first turn, you got to save every inch on the second turn. And conversely, if you're on a horse that's going to lose ground on the second turn, save every inch on the first turn. This horse never had an opportunity to save any ground at any part of the race.
Yeah, he's virtually 4 wide, 3 wide both turns. And the way the race shakes out, the winner is the pink horse at the back, Escandolce, who's sort of a nicely developing young horse. It's showing some good promise. They're knocking heads a little bit up top, and I wanted to ask, we were talking about the fractions. The fractions from a raw perspective weren't particularly fast, but sometimes I believe that it's more about how contentious the pace is rather than what the raw numbers say.
Well, I think horses use more energy when they're head and head. Just their natural competitive nature is going to keep them in the bridle. They're not going to relax and save energy as much. And just when Wild Night at the Opera looked like he was poised to make a run, he's attacked pretty aggressively by Mambo at the gym, who I think is a horse that needs a long look at, too, going forward. He kind of made, I think, a bit of a premature run and maybe got a little bit tired late. The race really fell into Escandolce's hands. I mean, everything went right for him. But not only did Wild Night at the Opera have that wide trip, Travis, he was the last man standing. Yeah. He fought off all comers, and all the horses that were engaged with him early backed up. He did remarkably well to hang in there as well.
The running line is going to say wide on both turns. It's not going to capture the fact this horse was game right down to the wire. Yes. And if it weren't for Escandolce, he finished the second. He probably gets bet a little bit more next time out. It just shows you how important it is to save ground and how important it is to watch these replays because they tell a totally different story than what you see on paper.
Yeah, no doubt. Yes, he was wide, but I think this tells the story. He was wide in a pace battle throughout.
Yeah. Absolutely. We're moving on. Race number 6 on the 14th. This is a first-time starter called Pedestrian. We're told it's named after some Greek mythology for Barry Schwartz. We've had a couple of first-time starters from the Mike Husham barn, and you're going to see in the famous Schwartz colors, black and white. There was a little bit of a story on this horse. The horse was bet down to 2-1, was running against a horse named Irish Heroine, who was well-meant, had good figures on paper. Walk us through this first-time starter, though, who didn't break all that well, but quickly put herself into the race.
Well, she kind of, I won't even say hopped, but kind of jumped out of the gate without really knowing exactly what she was in store for. And Jose Ortiz naturally wants to get her involved, get her mind in the game. So he kind of asks her, taps her on the shoulder, and then she does too much all at once and really jumps in the bridle and takes him. And I think that, more than anything else, Travis, shows that she's a filly that can run because she made up a lot of ground quickly. I think she just got a little bit tired.
Irish Heroine, the gray on the inside who's battling with her up top, was second to Bar of Gold in her career debut, a horse that went on to compete in some pretty big stakes races. So this is no slouch she's racing against. And even turning into the stretch here, she looks like she's going to win the race. But you made an interesting point before coming on camera. They're sort of lean in, make this race tight. Did that re-engage Irish Heroine a little bit?
I really think it emboldened Irish Heroine. You know, Adressia, Jose Ortiz wants to go down on top of her, make it tight for her. If anything, it kind of made her game. A lot of horses, when you don't get by them and you only got about a neck on them and you lean on them, you're going to make them fight. You're going to kind of fuel those competitive juices where I think you're almost better off drifting away from them a little bit and maybe they float. They don't feel the challenge. Horses are all tired at that point. You don't want to give them a reason to fight. You know, I think sometimes about, you know, going back to the Rocky movies, and you know, Mickey, his trainer, yelling at him, "Stay away from him." I think sometimes you're better off staying away from them than throwing that punch and making them punch you back.
That's interesting. Adrestra now, going to be a second-time starter soon, is going to get bet. And this is where the conversation of value comes into play, because we saw another Mike Cushion second-time starter over the weekend who won, but was extremely short. People know that he's good second time out.
Sure.
They're going to see a competitive running line. Likely was a pretty decent figure. You have to let price be your guide.
Yeah, no doubt. And she's probably going to take too much money, and maybe it's a race that you say, well, you know, let me watch it, or if she beats me, or use it in your multi-race sequence. I think this filly's going to be better as she stretches out, and now obviously with that experience under her belt, she should do everything right next time.
Second-time starter Adrestra coming to a race soon near you. Moving on to race number 6, we're going to talk about a horse named Secured Position in what was a very competitive and contentious allowance race going 6 furlongs on the 16th of January. I'm going to let him break here and get a few strides, and circle Secured Position is the pink and the green. A lot of what we would call us smart handicappers like Secured Position this day. This was a good start, but watch what happens here. After breaking forwardly and getting an early position, all of a sudden he finds himself back in 7th.
Well, it's a bit confusing because Manny Franco, who I think's been riding really well, left the gate with intention. He rode him out of the gate. The horse was actually in front at the point where you circled him. And after they went about another 40 yards, it was almost as though he decided, wait, I don't want to be here, or I'm not supposed to be here, and we don't know what the instructions were. But when you catch a flyer and your horse breaks and you've got that forward position, I wouldn't give it away. I also lived by another thing when I was riding, that you don't give away anything that comes easy. And it looked like it was coming easy at that point, but then Manny kind of dropped anchor and took back, and then he spent the rest of the race trying to get back to the position that he once owned. And I think it was a tough trip for this horse. For a horse that maybe doesn't have a big turn of foot, looks to me a little bit one pace. And, you know, we talked about it earlier. I think I wouldn't mind seeing him stretch out at some point on the dirt.
And you could see when they turned for home, he had some run. He still had a little bit of trouble finding where he wanted to go with the horse. And unfortunately, he's sort of going to flatten out here late in the game. David Aragona for Time for Me West, who joins us on Talking Horses, also tweeted about this. Why give up that forward position right off the mark? How important is it in dirt racing? Dirt races are won on or near the lead almost always. And when you are able to grab that early advantage right out of the gate and you give it up, you're giving up quite a bit of an advantage that you have.
Well, you know, I think about that movie Wall Street. Greed is good. In racing, aggression is good, particularly dirt racing. And not only did you see that he had to kind of search for room and using more energy to get back to where you once were. Think about all the kickback, and you could see it clearly when he turned for home, and I'll implore people to go back and watch that replay, how covered he is in dirt.
Yeah.
That sometimes impairs their breathing. It certainly gets in their eyes. Some horses resent it. We're going to talk about the next race horse that resents it. I think if Manny Franco had a do-over when he was in that position, he would fight to keep it. I think you use less of your horse fighting to hold forward position than getting back and then trying to work to get it back.
It's a curious trip. Secured Position won on debut, going straight to the front. In some of his most competitive races, he was forwardly placed. Obviously was not forwardly placed in here. He gets a look next time. He's going to go off a bit of a price because there's not much to talk about in terms of troubled trips or wide trips. There's no checking going on there.
Sure.
So the comment line might actually yield some pretty good value. You mentioned some kickback. The last race we're going to look at, a horse named Valerie Spirit. Now, before we watch we'll watch the replay now, but before we dive too far into it, this is a cheap race. However, there are some lessons to be learned in terms of watching these races and how horses look on replay, and things that horse players going forward can learn from and use in their own handicapping.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would necessarily bet this horse back. This was, you know, a pretty weak field. Let's be honest about it. But I thought this horse was interesting, and maybe from an educational standpoint, of a horse that subtly was not taking the kickback well. You weren't seeing her climb. She wasn't jumping up and down. I mean, she's having to steady a bit there, but that's normal first turn stuff. I wouldn't say anything, you know, that was so egregious that you would say that was her problem. But even here, down the backstretch, watch her head carriage. She's got her ears going back and forth, her head's up a little bit. She just doesn't look like a horse that's completely comfortable with the surroundings to me. And I think if you pay attention to the way she looks right now, and later on when she finally hits her best stride inside the 16th pole and her head is dropped and down, I think that illustrates what I'm talking about.
This shows you where watching horse racing in HD is so valuable, because you would not be able to pick up on these little idiosyncrasies of this trip if we were in standard def. You made a comment that it felt like she was almost running with the emergency brake on, hesitant or unwilling to move forward from there.
Yeah, and that's the best way to describe it. Like, she had the emergency brake on. She's wanting to go forward, but she's not quite sure of herself. Now, I think she got a nice ride from Katie Davis. I think she was just a little bit tentative, being inside and from the kickback. And you can't ever discount the kickback, particularly on the inner track. It comes back harder than any of the other surfaces on the NYRA circuit. Saving ground's so important on it, but at the same time, some horses don't handle as well. And you can even see here, she's still a bit green. She's on her left lead. She's going to find space between horses where she's not getting any of the kickback. Going to jump to her right lead in here. And this is what I'm talking about. Watch where her head really drops and she gets, to me, the way you want to see a horse run, with their head out and down and going forward. I have two thoughts about it. Obviously, she needs to catch another field like this to be competitive.
Right.
I think blinkers would help this filly. I really think she was looking at things and kind of stop and go, stop and go. And one thing you want is a fluid, continual move. You don't want that stop and go. To me, horses use more energy that way.
Yeah, and she did run down double main. Horses sometimes don't like to rally up the inside, and she was willing to do that. So there's some promise there. But again, it's a cheap race. That said, there are a lot of cheap races during the winter here in New York, and so you have to be able to decipher the trips of these cheaper races if you want to be successful, because they're often a part of the Pick 5 as well, which is the best bet we have going here. So there's a couple of things you can pick up on this trip. It was an eclectic group this week, wasn't it?
It really was. And again, some horses that I think you have to discern whether you would actually want to bet back and what price would warrant that, but more from an educational standpoint, maybe cluing you into another way to look at a race.
HD replays, it's a great thing to watch these things when you can see all those little details. If you have any comments, trips and traps at NYRAInc.com. For Richie, I'm Travis. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you back next week.